Let me start by welcoming everybody to this morning's meeting of the NHS Commissioning Board, and a particularly warm welcome to those members of the public who've joined us in the room. We're delighted to have you with us this morning. This is the last meeting of the board before we take on our full powers. That's going to occur from the 1st of April. Up until now, over the last year to 18 months, we've been in set-up mode. A lot of the business we've been transacting has been pretty heavy-duty stuff about hiring people, investing in IT, investing in estates, and making sure that from the 1st of April, we've actually got an organisation that will work. But part of it is also about vision. Part of it's about understanding how transformational the Commissioning Board can be for the future, with the transfer to it of the NHS budget, and with a responsibility that's totally focused on patients, on outcomes to patients, on patient satisfaction, and on ensuring the maximum value of investment of every pound in the NHS in terms of value for patients. So it's both a difficult transactional period and a time, I would say, of some inspiration and some vision for the future. As part of the way in which we've chosen to go about our business, we've insisted from the beginning that openness will govern everything that we do. Hence, we meet in public. Hence, these proceedings are transmitted by web stream, and a record of them is maintained on our website. But I have to say that not all of our business can be done in public. We've had yesterday a development session where we're trying to think through some of the more visionary thoughts. And yesterday afternoon, we had Paul Corrigan come and talk to us about commissioning, why it didn't seem to have worked in the past, what it was that we could learn from the past, and what it was that the Commissioning Board could really do to catalyse commissioning for the future along the lines that we've been talking about. Secondly, we've had this morning a private meeting of the board where we've had to deal with confidential business. Some of it is confidential because, for example, we can't sign off our accounts in public because they have to go to Parliament for publication. Part of it's confidential because it deals with HR and personal issues. But I have to say my determination as chairman is to ensure that as much as possible of all of our business comes to public session. That, I think, is a critical way of underlining our commitment to openness. Our meeting this morning is in public. It's not, and I stress it's not a public meeting. We meet in public. We will, after our first session, have a break in which we will merge and mingle and talk to those of you who've been good enough to come to our meeting this morning. But it's not an interactive meeting, so please don't do that. If there is any interaction, I'll simply have to adjourn the meeting, and I don't want to have to do that. We will have no fire drill this morning, I'm told, so if the alarm goes off, it's genuine, and we will all be escorted in a dignified fashion from the premises. I have apologies for absence, Adi. Nagib Kiraj, who was with us yesterday, hasn't been able to be with us today. He has sent us a note of his comments on the paper. And Margaret Casely-Hayford, who many will know is the head of legal services at John Lewis. She has a board meeting of John Lewis today. She was with us by phone yesterday, but not able to be with us in person. So we have apologies for those two. We are delighted this morning to welcome Mr. Robert Francis to join us. The proceedings will be that I will in a moment invite him to open up a discussion with us around the role of commissioning in a post-Francis world, and understanding what we can learn from his remarkable report. Robert Francis has shone, I would say, a forensic spotlight on some of the darkest recesses of the NHS, and it is a remarkable report that he has published. It gives everybody, I think, a mix of emotions, a sense of real shock and dismay that such appalling treatment of patients could occur in any hospital system in the world, and particularly in the NHS. But I think we also see it as a catalyst for change in culture and change in approach right across the NHS. And it's a catalyst which this board must take as the heart of its business over the coming years. So, Robert, we're delighted to welcome you here this morning. We're immensely grateful to you for joining us. Our congratulations to you for the exceptional work that you've done on the Mid-Staffs inquiry. I would like to invite you to talk to us. We'd like to then engage in a conversation with you. And at the end of that, I'm going to invite our Chief Executive to outline briefly how the board is absorbing your recommendations and how we propose to take forward some of the key points that you've raised. Robert, please.
Thank you. Do I press that?
I think it's on.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for those remarks, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to meet your board, a board which I believe is absolutely crucial to the future of providing safe and effective care to patients. I thought it might be helpful if, firstly, I focused obviously on that part of the luminous report that deals more with commissioning, and secondly, even out of that, just one or two thoughts. What I think I found about the experience of commissioning in Staffordshire, and obviously that's the only area that I was looking at, was that while the PCTs in theory, and indeed by law, had a duty to ensure the quality of services, in practice they were provided with neither the tools nor the expertise, nor one might almost say the bureaucratic inclination to undertake that part of their task. There are a number of reasons, I think, for this. Firstly, PCTs, like so much of the NHS, were subjected to a relatively constant process of reorganisation, so that they were expanded in number, they were contracted in number, staff kept on moving, so there was no corporate memory or indeed corporate continuity in this very important area. They were given targets which get a bad name, in some ways misguidedly, but they were given a set of targets which they focused on, which in retrospect at least, and possibly even at the time, didn't touch many of the areas of quality, but most importantly didn't really get at the fundamental requirements of running a safe service for patients. I think they probably knew that, and one might have thought, therefore, and it may be a learning point, that if you feel the tools aren't good for the job, then you have to take some other action. Obviously, it's not easy always to find measurements that touch the task. And I think, therefore, one looks rather to an attitude which failed to think about the impact for patients of information they did actually know about. And so I've listed in the report a number of warning signs which I would have suggested over the years, if looked at from a patient's point of view, even if they were finance, even if they were a matter of figures of that nature, might have caused the question to be asked, well, what is actually going on for patients as we speak? What does what we know about actually mean about the competence of the management? And if the management isn't competent in this field, is it possibly not competent in another field as well? And then, perhaps as importantly, and touching really on what you, Mr. Chairman, have done with this board in relation to engaging with the public, there was, I think, a lack of engagement with the public and patients in that PCTs had virtually no public profile, as I would understand it. Most people would not have, if you passed them in the streets in Stafford, would have no idea where to find a primary care trust, who sat on it, or what they actually did for a living. And I think that was reflected in what eventually was the genuine horror of the officials of the primary care trust when they did eventually meet in a public house, because that was the only place to do it, with the group of patients who wanted to tell them their stories. Which also brings to mind something that I put in my first report, but I never tire of repeating, that we need to think about, not just about numbers, but about stories. It is actually the real experience of people that allows us, I think, to remember all the time why it is there is a health service and why we need a safe and effective one. Enough perhaps about the past, but turning, if I might, to an overview of some of the recommendations I've made, which I would respectfully suggest give you and your board a real opportunity to make a fundamental difference to the service, and actually in a way which doesn't necessarily depend on some of my other recommendations which might require legislation or a government policy. And it's an area which I've not really spoken about very much so far. You'll understand that I've recommended that we should have a new set of fundamental standards which should be devised with the public and the professions and put into regulation by the government, which are those matters which it is absolutely intolerable not to meet. And I would think of things like not giving patients medication that's been prescribed to them, not keeping them clean, matters of that nature. What I would like to see is a different set of standards, which I've called enhanced quality standards, which I believe should be the role of the commissioners to devise, implement, and enforce. And these are all those matters which go into the package which we pay for. Now, the fundamental standards you just must demand on every occasion you commission a service. The enhanced standards are potentially something that can move and are all about improvement. But they are very real, and they are the things which will make the service a satisfactory and effective service. One of the problems in the past has that although there's a structure of agreements non-enforceable, which is always a rather difficult concept for a lawyer, but maybe they are now becoming more enforceable. But if you're going to have a contractual system, then make it a proper contractual system that works. So firstly, you need in your arrangements with providers, and by the way, this I would respectfully suggest applies whether we're talking about hospitals or primary care or joining everything up together. It doesn't matter. But we need to actually have proper specification of those standards in whatever the contract is. The second is that you need to provide for a form of rigorous monitoring, which was conspicuously absent before. So you can actually tell whether those standards are being met in the services you and your local commissioning groups commission. And that, of course, means having a measurement attached to each of the standards, which is workable, understandable by those who have to provide the service, and is owned, I would suggest, by the clinicians and other professionals who are actually at the front line, because if they don't understand and accept and find useful the measurements, then you will be getting nowhere. You then need a system of effective incentives and sanctions to incentivize achievement of the standards and to penalise non-compliance. And I appreciate the sanctions area is a matter of some concern, the dilemma of taking money away from places that are then made poorer and perhaps makes it more difficult for them to comply. But frankly, you shouldn't be commissioning services from providers who can't provide the standards you consider are necessary in the public interest. You should, of course, refuse to accept any breach of what I would describe as the fundamental standards, and you should play your part, along with the regulator, in stopping a service if it cannot comply with those fundamental standards. And I think that requires a change of culture, because in the past we've muddled along. There's been an encouragement, some would say a cover-up, but others would say a make, mend and do attitude, along the lines of there's a war on, what are you complaining about? But it is unacceptable that people are not clean, they're not fed, they are treated without their consent. Matters as fundamental as that, and which no doubt a range of other matters the public will tell you they think they demand in a hospital. But you will have the powers, as will your groups, to actually take the service away where it's necessary to do so. And I think there is a need, and I'll come to this, of openness and honesty about the inability of places to provide proper services. You need to have a proper a partnership with patients, not only in terms of putting them first in everything you think about, but also in finding out from them what it is they require, and then, of course, you have to make the judgments as to what can be provided within the resources allocated to you. Overarching all this, there needs to be openness, transparency and candour, and I've got a lot in the report to say about that, but it applies, to, I would say, to commissioners as much as it does to providers. And in particular, openness about welcoming complaints and concerns and explaining what you're doing about them, and transparency about how well everything is going. And that means a balanced approach, just as much here as anywhere else, of actually acknowledging difficulties and deficiencies, as well as quite properly claiming the credit for the things that are going right. We need a balance, and I think part of your responsibility also will be to ensure that providers also are being open and transparent and honest. And indeed, I've suggested there should be some quite rigorous rules about their honesty towards you, so that you're not being fooled by providers and they're telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, as we like to say in court. Finally, I would suggest that you should acknowledge, and when I say you, I mean you and commissioners in general, should acknowledge your own individual and collective responsibilities for promoting the necessary culture change, about which I've had a lot to say, and that's both an individual and a collective responsibility. Those are my general comments. May I just finish with sort of 3 rather more specific ones? General practitioners, who form a core part, as I understand it, of the new commissioning arrangements, didn't frankly come too well out of the Stafford inquiry, in that it appeared that although many of them harboured some concerns, they never put them all together to form an overall picture, and only really expressed them to the commissioners at all once the balloon had gone up, and they were specifically asked, is there anything you're worried about? And suddenly a whole list of concerns came forth. I think it's necessary to remind general practitioners, whether they're commissioners or not, about their continuing obligation towards their patients once they have been referred to some other provider for care. They should care for their patients, and when they get a referral letter, they are part of the system which can find out whether treatment has been provided in a satisfactory way. They are your eyes and ears, really, in relation to individual patients. That, by the way, is recommendation 123. Recommendation 124 is also about the responsibility for individual patients, because I would ask you to consider actually making sure, so far as you can, that individual patients get the service you, the commissioners, have paid for. And that doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean taking up every complaint. But what I suggest it does mean is that when there are complaints of poor service, a breach of the standards you've set in relation to individual patients, you make sure that they are being given a remedy and are being treated appropriately for someone who has been mistreated by a service for which you have paid. I find it rather odd that in commissioning to date that there's been so little a role for the commissioner in relation to the service provided to an individual. And as I say, don't take over the complaint system. You can't do that. But patients are entitled to redress, and I mean redress, I don't mean necessarily damages. You need, I think, to make sure that their complaints have been dealt with properly, and that you are getting value for money in that sense. And finally, and it is finally, Mr. Chairman, Plan B, this is recommendation 131. One of the great difficulties with commissioning, as I perceive it, has been the strength of bargaining position of the provider in many areas, as being in effect the monopoly provider of a service, so that whatever theoretical sanction has been available, in reality there's nowhere else to take the service. It seems to me, with respect, that part of commissioning ought to be to ensure that there are choices, there are alternatives. So if one provider or one form of providing treatment is slipping a bit, there is somewhere else to go. Because if you do that, then, and you are, and I emphasise, not competing on fundamental standards, but you're competing on proper quality issues, then I think there is a chance that everyone will be incentivised in a way they're not at the moment. Those are just a few thoughts, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful by way of introduction, and a number of ideas that I know my colleagues will want to pursue with us. I mean, one of the things that came out to us yesterday in our discussions was the problem of handover, that value could be added at each stage of a relationship with a patient, but with handover breakdown, for example, when a patient is discharged from hospital, but there is not a linearity of care, but a disjuncture, then we start to see real issues of loss of value of investment in commissioning by virtue of the fact that the chain doesn't hold together. Did that become apparent in your work in Staffordshire?
Well, there was that all too frequent complaint of discontinuity caused by a breakdown of discharge letters, and even at that very basic level. There were certainly examples of the lack of care in the community resulting in patients being discharged inappropriately or kept inappropriately, and real difficulties, I think, caused by that. So yes, I would think the answer is yes to him.
Let me take some comments. Kieran?
There's a lot in this around the relationship between the clinician, be it a doctor or a nurse, and the patient, and really listening to them. And you can call it culture, but there must be, a bit like your PCT, there must be tools, there must be things which can be commissioned. So were you able to get into saying, and the kind of thing we would like you to see and to commission would be this? I mean, we were at something yesterday talking about, how do you use a value-based standard?
Yeah.
Did a lot of that come out?
Well, I think the absence of such things did, because the contracts, standard form contracts then in place, had really very little by way of quality specification, and it was referral to other people's assessment of targets and so on. My take, and this is a general point coming from seminars and all sorts of things, is that you do need measurements that mean something to patients, and I think you need means of measurement which mean something to the doctors and nurses as well, so they know whether they're providing them. And therefore, I think and I'm not providing you with examples because I don't think I'm qualified to do that, but I think you actually need to have a consensus with your patients, and your medical staff about what they think they can measure, what they can actually achieve. And that probably doesn't help you very much, but that's a bit better an answer I can give you.
Ed.
Yes, thank you, Rob. I'm interested in what you said about GPs and their obligations to patients through the system. And when you talk to them, I'd be particularly interested in what they said were the stresses or strains or reasons why they may not have done what I think you said were their obligations, and what from that there might be in terms of guidance for us for the future.
Well, the one thing that was clear to me, that and they were not alone in this as a group, never joined up the dots between one patient and the next. So if they had a problem about Mrs. Smith, they would, in the traditional way, telephone Mrs. Smith's consultant. This, to be fair, being a hospital where it was possible to know who the consultant was, and they would deal with things on a one-off basis. But then the notes would get put back in the filing cabinet or wherever they were kept, and it wouldn't be joined up with the next case where there was some similar issue. So that was one point. The other was simply not feeling it was their responsibility to do anything systemic about it. Whereas clearly if they become involved in commissioning, one would have thought there would be. So I would say those are two things. They weren't joining up the information they had, and secondly, they weren't approaching it in a systemic way. One encouragement, I think, was that a number of practices were developing patients' forums which allowed them to bring patients together as a group, their own patients, to talk about these issues, and therefore, and those were being fed through, I think, to a more district-wide forum. And that was one way of linking patients, real patients, as it were, into the system and getting their real experiences. It's not obviously it wouldn't be the only way, but it would be one way of ensuring that happened.
Thank you. Moira Gibb.
Yes, very interesting comments and a great deal of food for thought in just in what you said today as well as in your report. I wanted to go back to relatively early in your comments about PCTs and the complete invisibility to the public. Obviously, when things are going well, people tend not, they've got a limited amount of attention. They worry about other things when things are going well. But they are inherently, commissioning is inherently not public friendly. It's a word that I've always struggled with explaining to people. And as the Commissioning Board, which is obviously involved in the CCG commissioning, but also more specialist commissioning, have you got ways in which you think we can, explain that to the public in a way that makes sense? Because I don't think they've kind of fundamentally understood it. Their experience of the NHS is health care, isn't it? It's and in a way, sometimes I think, well, our job is actually to be invisible and just be completely judged on that outcome. But in a sense, you were saying, no, we do have to struggle more with that presence and the public understanding of our roles. And Tim and I disagree frequently on how much attention we should give to that.
Well, I hope I'm not straying too far from my brief as a chairman of a public inquiry. It's reported to say that unless that is changed, we will not change some of the very fundamental problems that exist in healthcare, one of which is, I keep on being asked, what are your recommendations doing about this? The problem of reluctance to close down or move services when they could be provided better somewhere else. And I think if the public need to be persuaded that they are the purchasers of care, and I mean, I don't mean personal packages or whatever, but you on their behalf are purchasing the care they need. So they need to tell you what they need and how they want it to be delivered, and there needs to be an honest, open conversation about what can be afforded, where it best can be afforded, and there needs to be, therefore, a process of education. None of that can happen without commissioning becoming the front line, if you like, of the engagement with the public about what it is they want. And that's why I would suggest, with respect, you need to engage somewhat in some individual cases, because if the public can see their corner, or members of the public can see their corner is being fought by the Commissioner on their behalf, it is outrageous that Mrs. Smith has been discharged in the middle of the night from Hospital X. Why is that? What are you doing about it? Then I think you might raise your profile. I agree with you about the word commissioning, but don't ask me what word you should use instead.
Tim Kelsey.
I just wanted to follow up really on that and to say that my concept of commissioning is absolutely about being activist for patients and the public. It is about giving the citizens a voice in relation to health and care. And I just want to pick up on one aspect of both your incredibly insightful comments and the report itself, which is its very welcome focus on transparency. And I just wondered, if you were, as it were, in our shoes, what would be your most urgent priority in relation to transparency? What things should we be doing now that we are not doing to make transparent things about healthcare that will be relevant to citizens?
Well, if I speak as a potential patient, what I would like to know is if my GP is proposing to refer me to Hospital X or Doctor Y, I want to know how good that doctor, that hospital, that ward is compared with somewhere else I might choose to go to. I'm obviously not particularly concerned, as you would be, about how much it's going to cost to send me to X or Y, but what I do need to know, and if it's my child being sent somewhere, I need to have a means of knowing whether the place I'm being sent to is safe, effective, and how good it is compared with somewhere else I might choose to go. Now, what that measurement, what that information is, will vary according to what it is that my problem is, and that's why I think it's so necessary to engage, to give the professions the responsibility with others of devising fair and effective measurements for you, the commissioners, for the public, and the regulators. And that's a huge task, but I think it's a fundamental one, and of course I accept, this is where you may well come in, it has resource implications.
Bruce Keogh is one of the pioneers of that very transparency, certainly of clinical outcomes.
Indeed.
Bruce, did you like to add anything to that?
No, but I would perhaps like to just ask another question, if I may, Chair. One of the things that I had the opportunity to discuss with Mr. Kark at your inquiry was the complex relationship between clinical autonomy and professionalism. and how that plays into organisational governance in an NHS, which is a federal system of semi-autonomous, semi-competitive organisations. I think you found some flaws in that, and I just wonder whether you have any further reflections.
Well, I think the flaws were evident in the autonomy being used to but it would be resulting in an isolation of professionals from the business of running the establishment. There's one thing. The other is even this number of years after Bristol, a reluctance to engage in collective activity for the good of patients, whether it be clinical governance as such, or the sorts of things I've just been talking about, or making their voice effectively felt in hospital management. And a lot of blame is put on the managers about that, and that maybe there is some justification in that, but the professions whose first item in most of their codes of ethics are put the patient first should not just walk away and say, oh, I've got a job to do. And I think there is therefore a flaw there, and I think the professions need to, and I'm sure some are, they are in general, but they need to accept more the need to work in teams, to accept standard procedures, even if that compromises a little their preferred way of using one type of scalpel rather than the other, whatever it is, in order to make sure that what happens for patients is safe and effective. And so often we heard in the surgical department, for instance, because surgeons wouldn't agree on standard procedures, the nurses didn't know what instruments to put out for any particular patient. And you can't run a safe system if that's happening. And it's extraordinary that I should have to say something like that, but I do.
Thank you. Barbara Hicken.
Thank you. And just picking up really on the discussion you had with Ed about the role of general practitioners as coordinating the patient care, really in their provider role. I'd almost like to ask you the same question that where Tim asked what advice would you have for the board. I'd like to ask maybe on behalf of the clinical commissioning groups, these groups of general practitioners and their practices who are currently coming together to do local commissioning. If you were them, if you were trying to bring a local clinical commissioning group together at the moment with all these GPs, what would be your priorities? And not only would that help them, it might help us in our responsibility to develop them.
Well, they have between them collectively a vast amount of information about what is happening to their patients, where it's happening, who's providing the treatment, and how well it's being done. Now, they don't necessarily get that, or can't get that just from looking at a standard form discharge letter, which is usually uninformative. But so many of them will have had follow-up visits from their patients. Are they asking their patients when they come back, how was it for you in the hospital? Tell me about the consultant, was he all right? They just assume all that and hand out the next dose of pills. And I'm putting it simply, but that seems to me. So if they use that opportunity to collect information, why can't they then collate it and analyse it on a more collective basis? And it doesn't require, frankly, very much more effort or resource than they were already putting into seeing the patient. So I would have thought that is something I would prioritise, because I think you need a number of different ways, as many as possible, of extracting from your patients, who are the customer, the information that they have about what's been happening to them, and whether it's what they wanted to happen to them is the first and most fundamental question. And I don't know, I think GPs, like all the medical profession in general, has a bit of a way to go in treating patients rather than problems.
Victor, out of O'Reilly.
If I may, there's a couple of things that I want to ask you. The first is return to this issue of commissioning, because I feel passionately that commissioning is the means by which you understand the needs of individuals and communities, and it provides a platform for procurement and contracting. And so I just wonder, moving on from Barbara's question, it's not so much priorities for CCGs, but there's a priority for the system to engage with the public, and I just wonder whether you had any thoughts about how they might go about doing that, and to what extent should we be holding them accountable for having the methodologies that really showed they've engaged with the public. My other points were just about the question of culture, which you go into at some length, and guess given where we are now, I'm interested in moving forward. What are the signals that we as a commissioning board should be looking for? That culture has changed or is changing? You know, what do we look for? And the other thing is, do you expect more freeing up of both patients and clinicians to say what's wrong now? And how should we prepare the public for that? Because I think your report has released a kind of, it's almost been cathartic in some sense, and therefore we're going to be getting more people saying, look, and I think that's a good thing actually, but I wonder what your thoughts are about how we should prepare the public for that. And I'm also wondering about what that says for our leadership style and positioning, whether you have any advice for us on that, because I think how we lead the system, in a sense, is going to dictate what people say, how they see it, how they say it, and our relationship with the press, for instance. I just wonder. I know it's a lot of questions, but
yes, I'm sorry.
It's a long report. It's a long report. I've written them down. I can't.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the last one because then I might be struggling by the time we get back to number one. What should you be looking for and start? Well, in terms of the new culture, well, the first foremost thing, it seems to me, is that you need to individually, collectively exemplify what you see as being the new style. And I'm afraid that does mean, as it were, opening up the things that are difficult as well as the things that are easy to say. It means engaging in those difficult conversations with people who don't approve of what you're doing or how you're doing it, and listening to them, and either at the end of the day being persuaded they're right, or if you're not, explaining to them why it is you disagree with them, or if you do agree with them, you can't do what it is they say you do. Because I think how people behave elsewhere will be influenced very much by how bodies such as yours act in that way. I think there is a problem, and it's certainly a short-term problem, that if you open up all the bad news as well as the good, it's going to sound as though everything is bad news and nothing is good news. The fact of the matter is we were hearing it yesterday, and I'm hearing it all the time. As we sit here, bad things are happening to people in the NHS. It's not that they're not happening, it's not that the public aren't talking about them. I'm sure we all know our friends, relations and neighbours who will tell us, they tell me of course all the time now, but about not only their good experiences but also their bad ones. And for every single patient who has a bad experience, there will be a family who share that experience. And so you have already, whether you like it or not, a vast proportion of the country who will have some personal experience of bad news in the NHS. What they lack is, they would say, is any recognition of that from the people they see running the system. Now, some of that perception is of course, unfair. But I don't think it's a question of you're not going to be telling people things that they don't know already. What you're telling them is that you know about it and you are doing something about it. Yeah. And I think if we get it over in that way, then you will increase the confidence and trust in the system, not decrease it. And eventually people will begin to understand that, of course, there may well be some things that are matters of clinical judgment. There are some matters which, with the best will in the world, you're never going to change. And you will be able to separate those out from the things which are inexcusable and utterly unacceptable. And I also think if you do that, you will find it easier to persuade the public that they might well be treated in a more safe and effective way in location B rather than their preferred location A. So I think there are all those advantages. So I think I've done about 3 of your questions, but numbers 1 and 2 I think I've rather lost track of. Could you put those again?
It's more about your comments on holding the wider system to account for the engagement with the public on this commissioning. Yes. And I think you made some very valuable points about.
Well, I think it's difficult to say there's one way of engaging with the public, and in fact it would be dangerous to have one way, because I think the ways in which it can be done are multiple, and they will change over time. So, I mean, I notice in your agenda you have a proposal about a civil assembly, and I don't know enough about that to comment on it, and you won't want my view on it anyway. But I mean, that could well be one way, but you need, it seems to me, to have as many ways as possible of engaging. Everyone has different ways of wishing to engage, or not. And some people don't want to engage at all, but you need to find out what they say. And could I put in a plug? I know you'll have this in mind, but for those who can't speak for themselves, the vulnerable, the elderly, children, mentally ill people, there are a whole range of people who have needs, who need to be spoken for and not spoken at. And we need to think about those people as well. But the other thing I would say is that we need to find out what people want, and we need to find out what they think about what they get. It's probably a little unreasonable to ask them to provide the solutions, although of course you should talk to them about those solutions. I, as a patient, want to be treated and as best anyone can for whatever my illness is. And while I, of course, will surf the internet and find out my own diagnosis and so on, at the end, I'd prefer the doctor to be sufficiently trained to be able to provide the treatment for me rather than me do it for myself. So I think I'd say that about that. What you need to do is to make sure that the resources available, there's a free flow of ideas about what is good about public engagement. And it is a difficult area that no means, to my mind, as I saw, has really succeeded so far. So it's a big challenge.
Bill McCarthy.
I'm really pleased you made the point about our duty to reach out to people who are less articulate, disadvantaged, don't find it so easy to have voice. I think that's absolutely the heart of our mission and something we really have to work very hard on. But my question was a slightly different one, which is one of the themes in your report that really struck me was the story you tell of individual organisations pursuing their own interest rather than the interest of patients. We're now part of a new system with a lot of new sorts of organisations around. Have you got any thoughts, reflections on the sort of partnership working, the sorts of relationships, alliances you would expect us to be forming over the coming months?
Well, it is very difficult to get away from doing the systems business rather than patients, because transactional business is all consuming. There are the pressures there. I think it's, firstly, there needs to be very open and effective communication between all parts of the system, and that was woefully lacking at the time of the Mid-Staffordshire affair. Take it, the classic biggest example would have been the failure of communication between Monitor and the Healthcare Commission. They had a memorandum of understanding. There were a couple of desultory phone calls at local level, but nothing being chased up higher up. Now, that's a systemic issue to some extent, but it's also about personalities and people. And we mustn't forget the power of personality within a system, particularly when people have a slightly different idea as to what goes on. And we need to, and it's maybe a role for non-executives, I don't know, to ensure that communication is going on in a real and effective way, whether or not people like each other, and that difficult conversations are being held. I mean, I have found as chairman of an inquiry that it is sometimes difficult to, it would be easier to walk away from a criticism or someone who doesn't like the way you're doing something, and you physically always have to force yourself to listen, but those are the things you need to listen to more than the people who are telling you what a good job you're doing all the time. So I think you need the network to continually revisit to make sure people are connected with each other. And also, there is a habit of passing over information only that you think is relevant, and then whereas the recipient might think that something else is relevant, and that is a challenge. So you need to have a really good conversation about what is helpful to the role that a regulator is playing if you're the commissioner or vice versa. I'm sorry, those are just some vague thoughts in answer to that question.
I have Kieran and then Jane.
You talk about training, accreditation, codes of conduct, staff college. Can you say a bit more about that? Is there some you see we really need to get on and do today, or
Yeah.
things which, because something like training is a long-term thing by the time you work through the whole 1.4 million workforce.
Yeah, well, training for leaders is something I think is a very urgent matter. I've not made any proposals that we should restrict the pool of potential leaders, by which I mean people at board level, provider board level. But we need to have as diverse and wider sort of pool of candidates as possible. But for that reason, we need really good professional development to bring people on so they're ready to take those jobs. But most importantly, we need to ensure that all those who get those jobs are imbued with the common culture and have themselves and evidence themselves the right values which they are going to inspire their organisations to have. And openness and transparency and candour are extremely challenging things for leaders to do. And when the going gets tough, it must be really tempting to close down, not talk to the public, not say, accept that things are going wrong and so on. So we need leaders who have that sort of resilience. And I believe that, and also they're part of a community of leaders who share the same culture, who will support each other in it, and will also root out those who don't share those values. And that's one of the reasons I'm very keen on a staff college, a physical staff college, where people actually go through it. They meet, they're together, and I know bonding is a horrible word to use, but that, it is part of that they come out as a common creature, really. Not a clone, obviously there are different ways of doing things, but have that. And I think it becomes more urgent that happens, the more diffuse the system of provision becomes, and the more that foundation trusts have real autonomy and need it. And one of the things we need to get away from, if this system is to work, is the way that I believe even now, executives, particularly foundation trust boards or whatever, probably still have an instinct of looking up and worrying about what's happening up there, rather than looking out and worrying what their patients think of them. And that I think needs to change, and that could all be changed with the help of training and proper development.
Jane Cummings.
Thank you. What you haven't talked about this morning, which I was expecting you to, is about nursing, and the theme which runs throughout the inquiry report is around nursing and the need for caring, compassionate nurses. And certainly as a professional leader for nurses and a nurse myself, it was pretty difficult reading and a betrayal, I think, of what we stand for. You've talked today about fundamental standards, which absolutely must and expect, every patient should have that. And also about patient stories and patient experience, and again, something that I've worked with quite a lot over the years and is really valuable. But I wonder how else you would prioritise some of your recommendations, because there are a lot in there for nursing and the nursing profession. And I'm just interested in your views on where we should concentrate first, because I recognise you've also said don't just pick things off, you need to look at the totality of all of them.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry if I didn't mention nursing before. It's not because I don't think it is hugely important, but it's just I looked at the recommendations that said commissioning in them. But I think there is a role for commissioning in relation to nursing, an extremely important one. And I think in that regard I point to recommendations really I've made about the front line of nursing and giving space, if you like, and the resource for proper frontline ward leadership and responsibility. And it seems to me that through commissioning, probably you can ensure that those things come about. Part of it might be about staffing levels, but I don't think it is. It's actually about methods of working and whether a service is being delivered effectively through leadership. Because without that at ward level, things will go wrong on a shift-by-shift basis. So I would emphasise that, I think. What else would I emphasise? I think the recruit, insofar as it is part of your bailiwick, I don't know if it is, but the recruitment and training of nurses seems to be absolutely vital. I think that we need to recruit for values and the ability to maintain those values. And a point was made yesterday, you don't only need to recruit for them, you need to reinforce them throughout, and of course I would accept that. We need to, I'm afraid, I think, to reassure the public about the role of healthcare support workers in a way which I don't think we can at the moment. And I know it's not your job to think about whether or not well, it's not your job here anyway, to think about whether or not they should be regulated or registered. But even before that happens, it seems to me you could probably require precautions to be taken in relation to the recruitment of such people in hospitals and also their training. And I do think that there is a need in nursing, both for the qualified nurse and the untrained nurse, the unqualified nurse, to ensure they are people who have the aptitude for hands-on care and are committed to providing that. And there may be a few other things as well. And I'm not in any way wishing to downgrade the importance of proper technical training for qualified nursing, but they should never abandon, seems to me, the other part, the more physical part of their work. And particularly as they are going to have to be the mainstay of supporting the healthcare support workers in the highly important work they do. So those would be my immediate answers to your question, but is there some other area you think I should cover? Because
no, that's really helpful, and actually does fit very much with some of the work we're doing in Leeds. So thank you.
Paul Barman.
Thank you very much. One of the things that comes out of this for me is the immaturity of the dialogue between financial objectives and other objectives in all of this. I mean, it sings very clearly out of the story that you've drawn out here. And clearly one of the tasks we've got is to be the stewards of the money and the system, which calls for a different type of dialogue, doesn't it? A much more mature dialogue. I'm just wondering what thoughts you've got about, I suppose, our role in making sure the money doesn't compete with the other objectives, or indeed reinforces the other objectives. And secondly, I suppose, what broader guidance you've got for the finance profession in all of this to avoid being a blockage to the progress.
Well, if I take the last one first, I mean, a start would be that those who are charged obviously with the important work of looking at the figures should be remembering all the time what it is those figures mean. And those figures mean a resource to care for, protect patients. The resource is not there merely to balance the books. That's the point. There is a purpose for it, and it is a purpose which to serve patients, not to serve its own just a finance for the sake of it. There needs to be I would say, a continual conversation between those who guard the books, as it were, and those who are guarding the quality. And when it is, as it will be, and always is, necessary to make economies, or dare I say cuts, I'm afraid I don't like the word cost improvement plan. You will continue to use it, but I don't. That you need to have an honest conversation about the effect of those. And if the accountant, finance side, is told we cannot provide a service safely, complying with fundamental services with this number of staff, or this amount of money, or this amount of time, or this building, or whatever else it is, then the conversation might be, well, is there somewhere else we can take the money from, which is where that's not the case? Or it might be, well, we can't do it at all. But what you can't do, in my view, is any longer what's happened in the past, which is just to pretend there isn't a problem and carry on and hope it'll be all right on the night, because that is actually causing danger and risk to the patient. And I think if I may put it in a different way, if an aircraft was run on that basis, they probably wouldn't fly. And if a nuclear power station was run on that basis, we probably wouldn't be here today. So, and I think it is as important as that. So it's a matter of attitudes, I think, and about coordination of information so that the impact of what is happening is fully understood all the time. And one of the things lacking in Stafford was that staff reductions were made without any evidenced impact assessment. It was said they existed, but of course we could all say, well, we thought about something without evidencing it. And so there was no means of testing the proposition that it was safe to care for patients on an ever-reducing number of staff. And as it turned out, it wasn't.
Thank you, Robert, very much for a wonderful opportunity for us to engage with you in some of the questions that really are troubling us as a board. And your report could hardly have been better timed for the launch of the board and its commitment to taking forward a wholly new approach to culture and to communication and to enablement and supplementation, facilitation of the work that needs to be done by those who are commissioning and by practitioners across the piece, but above all listening to the patient voice and incorporating it into everything that we do. I'm going to ask David Nicholson, our Chief Executive, to give an overview of a way in which our thinking is being developed and how we would like to take the next steps. David.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks for the contribution, Robert. I think just before I go on to that, I just said 2 or 3 kind of personal reflections really on all of the report and what's happened since it, because I think one of the challenges I think that you've made to all of us who were involved in the NHS over that period is to sort of reflect on what it means for us and the way that we work. And I think it's been really important in terms of the way the Commissioning Board set itself up as, is to think afresh about the way we do things. And there are 2 or 3 things that occurred to me as you were talking. One of them is this kind of real enemy that we have of complacency, that somehow everything will be all right. And at its worst, the response of criticism of the service is there are lines to take, when actually what you need to do is absorb the criticism, understand it in a deep way, and do something about it. I think that's a really, really important reflection for me on all of that, and for all of us, I think, in the NHS. The second thing I think for me was in relation to the, in terms of culture generally in the NHS. We thought that the development of the NHS Constitution was a really important kind of stake in the ground about what a really good culture, what the principles, what the behaviours would be. And I wrote the Constitution. I was asked to do that. And I think what we underestimated was that the process to produce it would in itself embed it. And of course it hasn't. And so this issue about how you get the right culture in an organisation, we need to put the entire weight of the NHS and both of the patients and the people who work in it to shift that culture in the right kind of way. Because what you're describing, I think, in terms of culture, is quite a radical one. And the third thing for me, and it's particularly about me personally as a chief executive, I'm as no doubt you know, and others know, I'm very passionate about improving service for patients. I'm very kind of ambitious about the NHS, and what sometimes that turns into is an intolerance of poor performance, which results in the kind of responses, just get it right, when actually we need to be much more reflective. We need to think about why people are doing the things that they do. And I think that's a great thing about the report, really, is that it starts thinking about, so why were people doing the things that they do? And that, I think, is an important part for all leaders in the NHS going forward. So in terms of the Commissioning Board, and I know there's a kind of a real danger in all of the things, the response to the report is that people take a sort of pick and mix response. They kind of, those bits of it that they like, they go with, and and I do think that we've got a bit of time before the government makes its final response at the end of next month to make sure that that response is comprehensive in the way that we do things. But in a sense, we at the Commissioning Board are keen to get on with stuff. Stuff with now. So I just kind of want to just say one or 2 things about that. And I've kind of used the headings that you've used in terms of all of this. This thing about standards is so important, and have them really kind of set out, and standards which patients can understand. Because in the best will in the world, if we had hundreds of thousands of inspectors all going around hospitals all the time looking at that, we wouldn't pick up all the poor care that happened. And having patients engaged in a way that they can understand what those standards are, they can articulate them, and they can monitor them on our behalf is really important. And I think we're not in favour of a group of very clever people going off into a corner and thinking all of these up. We need to engage directly with patients to get the right standards that will. I think that's a really, and we're absolutely committed to doing that through all the mechanisms that we've got to engage in all of that. The second thing about the standard thing is this this thing about patient safety being at the heart of what we do. As you know, we've commissioned Don Berwick to do some work on behalf of the whole system, because it's not just a statement of policy, it's a kind of body language. It's patient safety is the top of the tree. It's the most important thing. We need zero tolerance to failures of patient safety. And so bringing Don Berwick with his expertise and understanding it from outside the service, I think is really important. And the Commissioning Board, through our Director of Patient Safety, through the work that Jane is leading, is going to take that forward and engage people around all of that. And linked to the kind of one of the final points that you made, Robert, was this issue about staffing on the wards. And you might think that, I mean, certainly historically, talking about staffing levels and all this thing might not have been seen as the role of commissioners, but I think it absolutely has to be a role of commissioners. We know there's a really good connection between staff that feel that they are supported and encouraged and developed and trained on the one hand, and the outcomes for patients on the other. There's a very strong correlation. So through the work that Jane is doing, we want to make sure there is complete transparency around staffing levels on wards. We want ward sisters to feel empowered, to know what their staffing levels, their minimum staffing levels are for those wards, and be able to speak out when they. And we're interested in that, and Jane's leading some work to make that happen. And on a kind of more smaller level, we have either just or are just about to appoint a national clinical director to focus attention on the frail older people, a kind of a national leader who can help us take all of that forward. So that's the kind of first bit. Oh, and you also made the issue about the incentives and sanctions around making sure standards are actually delivered. And we've committed ourselves to reviewing all of the sanctions and incentives that we have in the system to ensure that they're absolutely aligned with the kind of service that you've described. And even this year, we're thinking very carefully about how we can use those sanctions in a much more, and incentives in a much more direct way, which will cause difficulty in the system. When you, as you say, when you withdraw resources from organisations, sometimes it makes it difficult, but we think that's the right thing to do in the circumstances. So that's on the standards bit. The second bit is on openness and transparency and candour. We're starting down that road. We're certainly not at the end of it by any stretch of the imagination. The implementation of the friends and family test in itself a series of numbers. The important thing is for the NHS to embrace it and to do things about it, and there's good evidence around the initial work that we've done that can happen. There's the change in complaints, and I think there's it's one of the things I talk in my conversations with Mr. Clark. I talk quite a lot about complaints in relation to all of that, and getting to a place where a complaint is seen as a fragment of information that can help you improve your service is a really important cultural step for us to take. And Jane, I think, is working on that complaints review. In terms of the duty of candour, well, the government will make its judgments about what it's doing in terms of the legislation in relation to that, and I can't comment on what they'll do in relation to that. All I can say is that we've put a duty of candour into the contract this year. It may not be perfect, it may not solve all of it, but it makes, I think, an important statement and a signal about the way in which we think services should go forward. In terms of care and compassion, Jane is leading that work nationally for us. I think I've identified some of the kind of levers underneath that we want to support her with. There is a major set of initiatives around this that Jane will be announcing in the next 2 or 3 weeks that I think we'll find will help and take all of this forward. In terms of leadership, absolutely critical to all of this. We all know in our own our own experiences the impact of great leadership in organisations. So the Commissioning Board has in its business plan will be setting out the investment that we want to make in leadership development across the whole system. This is not just for commissioning, but for provision as well, and we genuinely believe that a physical place to bring leaders together in the NHS is a really important part of that, and we'll be thinking about how we might do that. So that focus on leadership, but not only on the kind of numbers, but the nature of leadership. One of the things I think nobody, I think, will be surprised on, if you look at the nature of leadership in the NHS at the moment, and we've done a huge amount of work to kind of get underneath what the kind of leadership is in the NHS at the moment. It's hardly surprising in the circumstances that the predominant leadership behaviours in the NHS are what in the jargon are described as pace setting, which is a set of leaders who are used to seeing objectives, of organising themselves to deliver those objectives, and then to move on to the next objective and to deliver those. The kinds of issues we're talking about here are much more complex, much more subtle. So how can we move the development, the quality of leadership into a much more kind of facilitative and supportive way as we go forward? In terms of developing those connections between providers, there is lots of things in the system at the moment that we kind of separate organisations. So how can we bring people together better? And we're sponsoring academic health science networks, which is bringing providers together across a patch to think about how they can work together, both to improve services for patients through innovation, but also spread really good practices across the system. And then in terms of useful information, I think that I'm absolutely, one of the things about when I read the report that struck me, this idea that, and you can see it in some of our organisations when they've produced their quality accounts. They've been little more, I guess, in some circumstances, than marketing material for the organisation. And getting that idea that we have to have the full reflection of our performance, both good and bad, is a really important part of that. That's why it's very, very important to us that we get patients having access to their own records through primary care. That's why it's so important that the work that Bruce is leading on the 10 surgical specialties this year, that we're going to produce detailed information for each of those specialties, open to the public to start to think about. But that's why care.data and getting more and more information out to patients in a digestible way that can help and support make decisions is important. I think that's the beginning, and it's absolutely not a complete package of things we as commissioners need to do. There is a lot more, but I think these are the things, in a sense, that we can now start to move forward and make a difference for patients.
David, thank you very much. Before I close the meeting for the coffee break, I want to make a statement about the Chief Executive. We stand at the moment poised at the commencement of one of the great momentous changes in the NHS. We will see the abolition of 161 statutory bodies, the creation of 211 new clinical commissioning groups. But this isn't just a structural change. This is about a change in culture. It's about a devolution. It's about unleashing the power of commissioning, perhaps for the first time in the history of the NHS. It's a hugely complex institution. The NHS treats in the order of 1 million people a day. There is no other organisation on earth with that reach and with that complexity and with that function of being a remarkable, not just healthcare organisation, but social support organisation that goes to the very heart of British society. The wake-up call that the Francis report has given us has drawn attention to numerous failings within the NHS, not just within mid-staffs, but of a system which has from time to time focused upon the wrong things and has had dire consequences for those who have been unfortunate enough to be adversely affected by it. There has been a search amongst many people who suffer a sense of dismay and shock from the events that have been disclosed by Francis's report, a search for accountability, and in particular a focus upon the work of David Nicholson, who through much of that period was a senior executive in strategic health authorities. Indeed, he held, because of the turmoil of reorganisation of that day, he held no fewer than 7 jobs in 6 years within the NHS, culminating in his appointment in 2006 to be the chief executive of the NHS. David's current formal position is that until the 1st of April he's employed 50% by the government as chief executive of the NHS and 50% by us, the Commissioning Board. With effect from the 1st of April, his employment transfers 100% to the Commissioning Board. I have been deeply worried by speculation in the media about his future. Over the recent weeks, I've reflected on several occasions with David about what has been said in the press. I have discussed it personally with each of the directors of the Commissioning Board, and I have discussed it collectively with the non-executive directors of the board. We have come to a clear view that David Nicholson is the chief executive of the board. He is the person who we wish very strongly to lead a strong executive team on the board. He is the person whose command of the detail of the NHS and his commitment and his passion to its future we believe to be fundamental to the success of the board. This is not, as it were, a statement of vulnerability, but a statement of strength. We look, David, to you to provide us with the leadership as we take through this exceptionally challenging set of changes. Thank you. We'll close the meeting for a coffee break. Thank you very much.